Good afternoon, all. My name is Jeannine Fier, and I'll be with you for this session. This session is being recorded. This is the storm surge modeling session with a presentation from Marshall Flynn of Flynn Metrics. Marshall Flynn was with the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council for 35 years, where he was the IT and GIS director. He has since semi-retired with one foot still in modeling and simulations. Unfortunately, Marshall cannot be with us today, so he has recorded his presentation for us to view as a video. So during this session, please make sure your audio settings are high enough to hear the video that will be shown. Marshall's work that will be presented today supports the current statewide regional evacuation study program for the state of Florida. I was involved with the statewide regional evacuation study program for several years, and I can attempt to answer some questions related to my experience and work with developing and modeling in the evacuation modeling realm and other GIS work. But any other questions in regards to the content of this presentation must be sent to Marshall Flynn at MarshARSH@FlynnMetrics.com. And I've also included his email address in the chat window. The recording of this session, which includes this video, will be uploaded to our Shrug YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'm going to start the video.
Greetings. Hi, I'm Marshall Flynn from Flynn Metrics, LLC. I used to be with the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council for 35 years and developed tools for GIS and was developing tools with the Evacuation Studies program. This is basically an overview of the tools that have been created throughout the duration of the program. The program is still ongoing, and we will review how the tools came to be and where they may be going. The modeling of storm surge has been going on for many years. It has its origins back in the ARC-info days, and SunSpark stations were the norm. I remember using Spark stations and first having the monochrome screens and then upgrading to the color screens, and that was a big deal. Back then, it was ArcGrid and TIN used for storm surge modeling, and the AML language for scripting. The first graphics-based distributed tool was built on ArcView 3.2, and that used the Avenue scripting language with map objects. And those particular versions had to be distributed as map files to other users. Then came the first statewide evacuation study around 2007 to 2008, and ESRI had moved on with ArcGIS 9.x back in those days with Microsoft VBA using Arc objects. That made using core elements of ArcMap a lot easier. We still had to distribute the script and model with the map file though. By the time the second evacuation study came along, ESRI was using add-ins starting at 10.x, which was built on Visual Studio and Arc objects. This was a game changer, because then you could just distribute the add-in itself instead of the actual map file. The third study update, evacuation study, involved enhanced surge modeling, but included more tool modules along with the actual tool itself. The original version of a storm surge model that would be for an early Tampa Bay evacuation study was ArcInfo version 7, using linear hypsography or quad maps with contour lines, along with the AML scripts to generate the 3D surface from TIN. The surge zones for inundation were derived from that. The first public sighting of this type of surge model output was when Wilson Schaefer from the National Hurricane Center displayed the version that we created at a national hurricane conference. So what is SLOSH? Well, it is sea, lake, and overland surge from hurricanes. It's a computerized model that NOAA and the National Hurricane Center created to estimate storm surge heights and winds resulting from historical, hypothetical, and predicted hurricanes. Basically, it takes a lot of simulated runs of directional storms and then produces output for the slosh basin. First, it creates the maximum envelopes of water from each direction, and then the maximum of maximums of all those envelopes, basically the worst of the worst. The slosh basins are typically elliptical, telescoping grids using 1 to 2 foci. So they are curved and show where the storm surge would actually raise or lower the surface water level. On the left, you can see the slosh display program created by the Modeling Center of the National Hurricane Center, and it is actually showing the resolution of the basin as squares at that scale. However, at a statewide scale, those grid squares are barely noticeable. That 3D representation shows how this slosh basin, TP3, circa 2007, depicts surface water level and also how it runs up over the land, with the more orangey squares typically on top of the land. This is an exaggerated view, though. However, it does change that much from the open sea in towards the shallower areas. On the right, you can see all the different slosh basins there have been in the continental United States. Currently, there are only 4 active slosh basins in Florida, with most of the state covered by the west BBS, the south SF1, northeast NF1, and on the panhandle, one county with Mississippi MS8. Why would you try to make a tool to model surge? Well, NOAA and the National Hurricane Center had created a slosh display program, mentioned on slides 4 of this presentation, which showed the storm surge in a color as well as an option where it shows the depth, among other features. However, the surge rendering is low resolution and displayed at basin grid resolution. Those grid squares are quite large, so it is great for national scale, but not great for a county or city scale. We needed something to adapt to better available topography, especially with newer elevation data from LIDAR coming out during the early part of the evacuation studies program. This led to the birth of the surge model, not slosh model, but surge model, a model that was more like an extension of the slosh model and resulted in higher resolution output. It was proven with local and regional level projects and then was adopted to be used at the statewide level with evacuation studies programs. Evacuation studies were done piecemeal as funding was available and never together with other regions at the same time. So in 2007, the statewide regional evacuation studies program, referred to as SRES, was developed to coherently update the regional evacuation studies for the whole state of Florida at the same time using consistent, repeatable methods. It created a framework for updating the data necessary for evacuation zone delineation. County evacuation zones were the true goal for this process. With the study, it created a surge model from official state's storm model, which was slosh. The use of slosh and the evacuation studies was even written into the legislature. SRES had all regional planning councils create surge zones using same repeatable methodology for their counties. This allowed county emergency management staff to develop evacuation zones for public safety. The created surge zones were further incorporated into other aspects of the studies, like shelter analysis and transportation analysis. The stars seem to align for GIS and a project of this magnitude. It certainly was the right time for ARCGIS. The study included the first statewide Florida coastal LIDAR coverage flown all around the coast in roughly the areas where storm surge would likely occur. The detailed elevation was key to inundation delineation. The need for consistent results across the state was important as well, so using GIS with repeatable results was perfect for the SRES program. It needed to have a distributable tool through VBA at the time, and later, of course, add-ins, and it had to be available with ARCGIS. The use of file geodatabases and their structure certainly aided in the organization of the data used on a statewide scale, where previously it was all shapefiles. The images below basically show the progression of the creation of surge zones, where it starts from a LIDAR digital elevation model, which then allows the National Hurricane Center to create storm slosh basins in low resolution, and then we go back to using the same DEMs in high resolution to process the storm surge zones. So what about the actual surge model? Well, as I mentioned, the slosh basin is created by the National Hurricane Center in a grid format with large grid squares. But water doesn't behave like what is depicted in the slosh grids at the human or local government scale. The surge model is meant to alleviate that square, jagged puzzle or aliasing in imagery terms. The obvious answer was interpolation, so the grid squares centroids can be interpolated to get an ocean surface. This used to be done with TIN, or triangulated irregular network, and ARCGIS in the ARCINFO days, but now it is done with Spatial Analyst. The tools of Spatial Analyst allow all kinds of detailed processing with the raster layers. The model uses the maximum of maximum surge values from the slosh basins. I mentioned previously that the maximum of maximums, or MOMs, are the highest or maximum values of the maximum envelopes of water, also known as meows. The model also creates zoned output for counties to use. The surge zones represent categories 1 through 5, and there is a slight correlation between categories and evacuation levels of A through E, but not always the case, as counties can assign levels for their own particular criteria. This is an illustration taken from the ArcView days showing basically what the model is intended to do. On the left, you can see the slosh grid basin version, where the squares are used to delineate the storm surge with grid squares. On the right, you can see the interpolated version that the model produces, and you can see how it hugs the coastline as it would in real life. This was the obvious route to take, and this is what we did. For a model to work locally and regionally across the whole state, it has to have certain features or characteristics that make it work for a statewide program. It has to show output with enough detail to distinguish it from national scale tools. It has to be usable by all regions, no matter where they are in the state. There should be a consistent processing resolution of the model, and we chose 10 feet raster resolution. The data input should be consistent as well, and the same across the state. We chose the newly flown LIDAR DEM, the regional slosh basin, there were 10 at the time, and a sea layer of sufficient detail. The model had to be run on ArcGIS Basic, which was formerly ArcView, and this was the minimum license level a county or regional planning council would have. The key ingredients to the surge model were the detailed LIDAR-based digital elevation model and the sea layer. The digital elevation model with the high detail allows the surge to follow the topography in a detailed way, important for local government scale use. We could then process the model all the way up to the resolution of the DEM. For processing time considerations, we did not go beyond 10 feet as a raster pixel. The sea layer allowed the use of contiguous hydrology processing because the DEM did not always have bridge structures cut out or burned for water to flow beyond. The sea layer allowed the processing to bridge the gap created by the higher elevation structure blocking the flow. And in these images, you can see that the circled areas are areas that should have been burned or cut out to allow water flow or hydrology to continue, and they weren't. So by having the sea layer, you actually get over that hurdle and get the surge beyond those, because the surge is contiguous at that point. Here you can see the graphic user interface that was used in 2016. On the interface were grouped and defined buttons and controls for the users to choose to be consistent across the state. For instance, you can see the DEM load button, the slosh basin load button, and the sea layer load button on the left, arranged and labeled so no confusion would happen. This is a summary view of what the surge module of the tool actually does. First, you're starting with the slosh basin, which gets converted into centroids with a selection of only the ones that are not dry in the basin. Then the values for that particular category are used to create a surge height surface, which is the third image. Then that surge height surface subtracts the digital elevation model surface from it, which gives you a depth raster, which is the fourth image. All those pixels that are above the actual elevation are selected, which gives you the inundation surface or limits, which is then converted into polygons. This is what is used by the SRES program to distribute to the county emergency managers to create evacuation zones. Typically, it is a composite version with categories 1 through 5 as zones with color classifications. This is just category 3 as a demonstration. When distributing an app or a tool across a wide area, like the state, there are some particulars you probably want to take into consideration. For instance, not everyone has the same desktop or laptop setup and file structure, so create your app to be aware of these differences. Also, add ways to normalize settings that could be different, such as adding projection tests and utilities to correct certain things. You also want to make checking for updates and updating easy as clicking a utility or a button that checks for the latest version and then updates it. You also might want to add symbolization to the outputs so the users can see what the output was meant to look like. Also important to include detailed logging for troubleshooting, because invariably there will be errors because of other people's setups or input data or projections or any number of things that you need to figure out just what happened. Now for the coding. So why ARCGIS? Why not use Python? Well, Python doesn't lend itself to good graphic user interfaces, and Python is also not integrally connected to the operating system. ARCGIS, on the other hand, are actually the building blocks for ARCGIS. All the tools and all the functions that are in ARCGIS can be tied back to ARCGIS namespaces. ARCGIS is also wrapped in a powerful SDK when used with Visual Studio IDE. With all this access and control to the bones of ARCGIS, it's an obvious choice. Some helpful tips would be, you want to control the projections and keep them consistent. ARCGIS does not like different projections with geoprocessing and will reward you with empty outputs. You want to show status feedback on processes to the users so they know what is going on during the tool run. Otherwise, they may inadvertently stop it, thinking it was finished. Use the geoprocessing tools built into ARCGIS whenever possible, but always watch the environment variables, because if they aren't right, they will surely fail. As I mentioned earlier, include download and update options for version control and send all output to a file geodatabase for organization and ease of handling. Situations and methodologies do not always remain static for long-term projects or programs. The actual program itself may change, or the data that is used in the program may change. Recently, around 2019, the National Hurricane Center retired the Slosh display app in favor of a new online model called HurryVac. With this change, the polygon slosh basins are no longer produced by the National Hurricane Center. As the always continuing growth and enhancement of the National Hurricane Center, old slosh basins are retired and new basins come online. Where we used to have 10 basins in the state of Florida, we now have 3. one large one in South Florida, one large one in the western part of Florida, and one large one in the northeast part of Florida. 4 if you count the Mississippi Basin used for one county. These changes can affect the continuity of your program, as well as the use of tools to process your program needs, so you must be prepared to adapt. Here's an example of the South Florida Basin replacing 6 basins. This happened in 2016. When this happened, though, the new basin still remained in polygon format. To continue creating products for the program, you have to go with the flow or adapt, as I mentioned earlier. As mentioned in previous slide, the first basin change in 2016 did not affect the model or tool very much at all. There were some slight modifications based on the actual data and tide differences that were introduced, but the structure and format of the tool did not change. The next 2 basin changes or upgrades did affect the tool core coding, and that was when the Western Basin came online and the Northeast Basin came online, BBS and NF1 respectively. So there's no more polygon basins anymore in the National Hurricane Center SLOSH products, and they initially only provided raster geotiffs in the MEOW format, not MOM format as we typically use. They also did not provide the surface height as they always had in the past. They now provide only the depth. For these reasons, to create a new evacuation study update, the tool had to be overhauled completely and recoded from the ground up. Going forward, the GIS tool still had to create the same data output we'd used in previous years. We still needed MOM data output, which was not available. We still needed storm surge, storm tide height, which was no longer available. So we had to work backwards like reverse engineering. To get to the same outputs we produced previously, we used the power of GIS. The National Hurricane Center geotiff depth rasters had to be converted into points. For the process to work, we only used shallow depth rasters and only over land. Then, using the raster DEM, we backed out a new height value, which was added to the points. This created new surge height values to interpolate into a new surge surface height raster. This new surface was transferred over to a new empty hybrid surge basin and the centroids, and then processed like we did before in previous updates. The following slide shows the progression. In this series, you can see the progression of the new process. Number 1 shows the geotiff depth raster. This is what we were provided, but in MEOW format. Those MEOW rasters had to be converted into maximum of maximum or MOM rasters first. Number 2 shows the points created from the shallow MOM depth over land. This is how we could get a new surge surface. The combination of the DEM plus the shallow depth gave us the surface height values on those points. Number 3 is the interpolation of those points to produce a surge surface raster. Number 4 is the new depth raster at the same resolution as the DEM created from the DEM subtracted from the new surge height raster. Number 5 is a conversion to polygons of the depth raster higher than the DEM. Number 6 shows the difference between the National Hurricane Center resolution and the SRES output. The NHC typically uses 30 feet to 95 feet raster resolution depending on which basin it is. SRES resolution is at 10 feet, and you can see where the surge is stopped by a topographic feature higher than the surge. The latest iteration of the tool had to be flexible mainly because of the changes that happened from the National Hurricane Center, but also to include more features and make it a jackknife type of tool. Included in the latest version is a standard surge from either geotiff or polygon basins, sea level rise and sea level rise with surge combination, a rain event model, a demographics tool that creates input for the SRES transportation model called TIME, the Transportation Interface for Modeling Evacuations, and a damage model, which is a rudimentary damage model for wind. Depending
Sorry for the abrupt end to that video, everyone, but that's really all we had to share today from Marshall's video regarding his tools for storm surge modeling. I would like to open up the session to questions. If you guys would like to type in your questions into the question box. And if there's any questions I can answer, I will definitely answer them right now. Any others, as I said, will have to be answered by Marshall himself. And again, his email address is marsh@flynnmetrics.com.